boss humiliates overweight cleaner, but never imagined she was the company owner's mother. Margaret Wilson wiped her damp face with the sleeve of her navy blue uniform as cold water trickled down her collar. Laughter echoed through the halls of Williams & Associates, one of the largest consulting firms in New York, as she stood tall, staring directly into Stephen Miller's eyes. "What's wrong, Margaret? Gonna stand there like a wet lamppost?" Stephen taunted, still holding the empty cup. "Or are you gonna clean up this mess you made on the floor?" The HR manager burst into laughter, along with two other executives who had stopped to watch the show. Margaret bent down slowly, picked up the cleaning rag she always carried on her cart, and began wiping the marble floor. Her movements were calm, almost serene, as if this humiliation were just another daily task. "Look how obedient she is," Stephen remarked to his colleagues. "That's how you deal with lazy employees. This one thinks she can wander the halls doing nothing." Margaret stood up and pushed her cleaning cart toward the service elevator. Her steps were steady, but there was something in her eyes that Stephen couldn't decipher, a calmness that unsettled him deeply. "Margaret, where do you think you're going?" Stephen shouted. "You still have the 10th floor bathroom to clean, and this time I want you to wax the entire hallway, twice." She stopped without turning around. "Yes, Mr. Miller." Her voice was quiet, but there was a firmness that made Stephen clench his fists. Why didn't this woman grovel like the others? Why didn't she cry or beg for mercy? That irritated him more than any outburst would have. As Margaret stepped into the elevator, Deborah Johnson, the legal department secretary, watched everything from her desk. She had worked at the company for 20 years and knew every corner of that mirrored glass building on Fifth Avenue. She also knew every employee, every story, every poorly kept secret in those halls. And Margaret Wilson had intrigued Deborah for months. It wasn't just that the cleaner spoke 3 languages fluently, something Deborah had discovered by chance when she overheard Margaret speaking on the phone in English and then Spanish with suppliers. Nor was it just her upright posture, which contrasted with the expected submissiveness of someone in her position. It was the way Old Bill, the company's longest-serving security guard, greeted her, with respect, with warmth, as if she were important. "Mrs. Wilson," Old Bill always said when she passed by the front desk, "how was your day?" And she always responded with a genuine smile, asking about his family, his grandchildren, the high blood pressure he'd been struggling with. Deborah knew Old Bill had worked at the company since its founding 30 years ago. If anyone knew all the secrets of that place, it was him, dear listener. If you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now, back to the story. On the 10th floor, Margaret pushed her cart down the empty halls. Most employees had already left, leaving only the workaholics and those with tight deadlines. She stopped in front of Stephen's office door and took a deep breath. Through the glass, she could see him on the phone, gesturing wildly, probably closing yet another deal that would earn him a hefty commission. Stephen Miller had joined the company 5 years ago, hired as a senior manager with promises to revolutionize the sales department. And he had delivered. His numbers were impressive. He closed deals others deemed impossible. Won clients the competition had been courting for years. That's why the board turned a blind eye to his questionable management tactics. But Margaret knew things the board didn't. She opened the office with her master key and began cleaning. Margaret always left Stephen's office for last, when she was certain he wouldn't return. As she dusted the shelves, her eyes scanned the documents left on the desk. Sales reports, contract proposals, client correspondence. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but Margaret had experience reading between the lines, deciphering codes others couldn't see. In a slightly open drawer, she spotted part of a document that made her pause. Carefully, she pulled out the sheet. It was an internal report on cost reduction strategies, dated from the previous week. The document proposed significant cuts to the cleaning and maintenance staff. According to Stephen, the company was spending too much on unnecessary employees and could outsource all cleaning services. Margaret photographed the document with her simple cell phone and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. 3 floors below, Michael Wilson was working late in his private office. At 35, he had taken over the company's operational management 2 years earlier, after his mother stepped back due to health issues. Michael checked the clock. It was almost midnight. His mother always said working too much wasn't a sign of efficiency, but of poor organization. He smiled, remembering their conversations when she was still active in the company. Margaret Wilson had founded Williams & Associates 30 years ago, starting with a small office in Soho. The company's surname had been chosen for strategic reasons. In the 1990s, a company with a masculine name inspired more confidence in conservative clients. She had built the business from scratch, working 18-hour days, winning over every client with competence and dedication. By the time Michael was born, Margaret was already one of the most respected businesswomen in New York's consulting sector. But few knew it. Officially, Margaret Wilson had retired from business life 2 years ago. Heart problems had forced her to slow down. Michael took over operational management, but strategic decisions still went through her. What no one knew, not even Michael, was that Margaret hadn't truly stepped away. She had returned. Anonymously, discreetly, she had gotten a job as a cleaner in her own company to observe firsthand how things were running. With a simple wig, prescription glasses, and a few subtle changes in posture, she had become unrecognizable to anyone who didn't know her intimately. Only Old Bill knew who she really was, and he guarded the secret like treasure. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work at 5 as usual. The building was empty except for the overnight security and the outsourced cleaning staff who handled the lower floors. She went straight up to the executive floor where she had full access. Margaret knew every corner of that building because she had been involved in every detail of its construction. She knew where the security cameras were, the blind spots, exactly how to move unseen. In Stephen's office, she opened his computer. The password hadn't changed since the last time. Stephen always used the same one, Winner HR 2019, the year he had won an internal sales award. Margaret accessed Stephen's email and began reading the messages. What she found left her deeply troubled. There was extensive correspondence with outsourcing firms discussing rates for taking over cleaning services, but that wasn't all. Stephen was also negotiating the dismissal of long-time employees, citing necessary restructuring to modernize the company. On the list of employees marked for termination were names of people Margaret had known for decades. Old Bill was on the list, Deborah too. Loyal, competent people who had helped build the company. But there was something worse. Stephen was using insider information about clients to negotiate personal contracts. He had set up a shell company in his wife's name and was diverting contracts from Williams & Associates to his own business. Margaret printed all the evidence and stored it in a folder she took to her locker in the cleaning supply room. Then she erased any trace of her presence in the system and carried on with her normal routine. By 7 in the morning, when the first administrative employees began arriving, Margaret was cleaning the 8th floor hallways as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, Margaret," Deborah greeted as she stepped out of the elevator. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. How are you today?" "Fine, thank you. And you? I heard Mr. Miller gave you a hard time yesterday." Margaret stopped wiping the handrail and looked at Deborah. There was something in the secretary's tone that suggested more than just concern. "You saw what happened?" "I did." Deborah lowered her voice. "And it wasn't the first time, was it?" "No, Mum, but we endure it." "Margaret," Deborah glanced around, making sure they were alone. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Margaret nodded. "Have you always worked in cleaning?" The question caught Margaret off guard. For a moment she hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "It's just... you don't seem..." Deborah searched for the right words. "You speak very well. You carry yourself differently. And Old Bill treats you with a lot of respect. Old Bill is a good man." "He is, and he doesn't show that kind of respect to just anyone. He's worked here for 30 years, Margaret. He knows everyone." Margaret resumed cleaning the handrail, carefully considering her response. "Sometimes life takes us down paths we didn't expect, Mrs. Johnson. Everyone has their story." Deborah nodded, but Margaret could tell the secretary wasn't convinced. There was a sharp intelligence in that woman's eyes. Around 10 in the morning, Stephen arrived at the office. As usual, he made an entrance, talking loudly on the phone so everyone would know how important he was. Yes, Dr. Parker, leave it to me, he said into the phone. The contract will be signed today. No one offers the terms we do. Margaret was cleaning the windows of the meeting room when Stephen passed by. He stopped, looked at her reflection in the glass and smirked. Margaret, have you lost weight? He asked loudly, making other employees glance over. No, wait, still just as fat. Must have been my imagination. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away, embarrassed. Margaret kept cleaning as if she hadn't heard a thing. Hey, I'm talking to you. Stephen stepped closer. When your superior speaks, you answer. Margaret turned slowly. Yes, Mr. Miller, do you need something? I need you to learn some manners, and I also need you to stop dawdling in the hallways. There's a lot to clean in this company. Yes, sir? And one more thing. Stephen lowered his voice but still spoke loud enough for others to hear. I saw you messing with the supply room computer yesterday. Cleaning staff don't touch computers. If I see it again, you're out. It was a lie. Margaret hadn't touched any computer in the supply room, but she recognized Stephen's strategy. He was creating a record of supposed infractions to justify firing her later. Understood, Mr. Miller. Good. Now get back to work. Across the hallway, Michael Wilson stepped out of the elevator and caught the tail end of the exchange. He didn't know Margaret personally. There were hundreds of employees in the company, and he was still learning to manage everything. But something about Stephen's behavior bothered him. Michael approached Deborah. Deborah, who is that cleaning lady? Margaret Wilson. Why? How long has she worked here? A few months. Why the interest? Michael watched Margaret walk away with her cleaning cart. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. Just curious, does Stephen always treat employees like that? Deborah hesitated. How to answer that question for the owner's son without sounding like she was gossiping? Mr. Miller has a very direct management style. Direct? He's very demanding. Michael realized Deborah was being diplomatic. He made a mental note to observe the company dynamics more closely. Maybe his mother was right when she said he needed to understand the day-to-day operations better. At lunch, Margaret went to the cafeteria on the ground floor. It was one of the few moments in the day when she could relax a little. She ordered a veggie sandwich and orange juice and sat at a corner table. Old Bill approached. Mind if I join you, Mrs. Wilson? Of course, Old Bill. The security guard sat down and lowered his voice. I wanted to talk about that report you showed me yesterday. And? I spoke with some old colleagues. Seems like Miller really is pushing for changes in the company. He convinced part of the board that they need to modernize operations. Does Michael know about this? I don't know, Mrs. Wilson. The kid's been busy with big clients, and Miller's smart. He only discusses these things with the directors he's got wrapped around his finger. Margaret chewed thoughtfully. Which directors? Thompson from finance, Anderson from sales, and the new one, Jennifer, from marketing. Margaret knew all three. Thompson was ambitious but not too bright. Anderson had always been easily swayed. Jennifer was young and impressionable. Old Bill, do you know Stephen well? I do. I've been here since he arrived. At first he was more discreet, more respectful. But as he climbed the ranks, he changed. Changed how? Got arrogant, started treating lower-level employees poorly. And there are some shady deals he's involved in. What kind of deals? Old Bill glanced around to make sure no one was listening. I've seen him take envelopes from people who don't work here, and there are calls he makes in secret, always after hours. Can you find out more? I can try, Mrs. Wilson, but you need to be careful. If he suspects anything. I know, Old Bill, but it's important we figure out what's going on. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. That afternoon, Margaret was cleaning the bathroom on the 10th floor when she heard voices from the meeting room. The door was slightly open and she could hear the conversation clearly. The report is ready, Stephen, said a voice she recognized as Thompson's. The numbers justify the changes you proposed. Great, Stephen replied. What about Michael? He doesn't know yet. I thought it'd be better to present the full plan at once. Perfect. When are we presenting? At the next board meeting Friday. Margaret's stomach tightened. It was Thursday. She had less than 24 hours to act. "What about the employees who'll be laid off?" asked a third voice, a woman's. "The list is ready," Stephen said. "We'll start with the oldest and highest earners. We'll call it restructuring. Won't there be issues with the union?" "Not if we do it right. We've documented some violations, built justifications. Legal's already preparing everything." Margaret slipped out of the bathroom quietly and went upstairs. She needed to think. She needed to act. On the 11th floor was Michael's office. Margaret knocked on the door. "Come in." Michael looked up from his computer and was surprised to see the cleaning lady. "How can I help you?" "Mr. Michael, I'm sorry to bother you. It's just, I need to talk to you about something important." Michael noticed that Margaret's voice was different, firmer, more articulate. "Go ahead." "It's about Mr. Miller." "What about Stephen?" Margaret took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "He's planning to fire long-time employees and diverting company contracts." Michael leaned back in his chair, stunned. "Those are very serious accusations. Do you have proof?" Margaret opened the folder she was carrying and placed the printed documents on Michael's desk. "Yes, sir, I do." Michael examined the papers. His expression grew more serious as he read. "How did you get this information?" I work late at night, Mr. Michael. Sometimes I see things, hear conversations. Margaret, this is extremely serious if it's true." "It is true, sir. And there's more." Margaret told him about the conversation she had overheard earlier in the conference room. Michael fell silent for a few minutes, processing everything. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." "Have you always worked in cleaning?" It was the second time that day someone had asked her that. Margaret chose her words carefully. "No, Mr. Michael. I've done other work before." "What kind of work?" "Administration. Business management." Michael studied her closely. There was something very familiar about this woman. "Margaret, what's your full name?" "Wilson, sir." "Margaret Wilson." Michael felt a tightness in his chest. Wilson was his mother's maiden name, but that could just be a coincidence. "How old are you, Margaret?" 55, Mr. Michael. The same age as his mother. Michael began to sweat. "Margaret, may I ask, do you have children?" Margaret looked directly into his eyes. "Yes, sir. One son." "What's his name?" "Michael," she said softly. "Michael Wilson." The silence in the room was deafening. Michael stared at Margaret, truly seeing her for the first time, ignoring the simple wig, the prescription glasses, the cleaning staff clothes. And then he saw it. The same brown eyes that had watched over him as a child. The same smile that had comforted him after nightmares. The same hands that had helped him with homework. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret removed her glasses and smiled. "Hi, son." Michael stood up, still in shock. "Mom, what? How? Why are you working as a cleaner in our own company?" "Because I needed to see with my own eyes what was happening here," Margaret said, stepping closer to her son. "Michael, when I stepped back from management, I left you in charge of everything. But a mother never stops worrying." "But why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to learn to lead on your own. But I also needed to be sure the company was in good hands." Michael hugged his mother, still processing everything. "How long have you been working here?" 3 months. "And in that time I've discovered a lot, Michael. Things you need to know." Margaret told her son everything she had uncovered about Stephen, the diverted contracts, the layoff plans, the corruption, the humiliations. "Mom, I had no idea. Stephen always showed me excellent numbers, impressive results. He's smart, son. He knows how to manipulate information. But in these 3 months, I've learned that good numbers mean nothing if the company's culture is rotten." Michael sat back down, running his hands through his hair. "What do we do now?" "We act. But we have to be smart. Tomorrow is the board meeting where he'll present the layoff plan. It's our chance." "Our chance for what?" Margaret smiled. the same determined smile Michael remembered from when she was about to close a big deal. Our chance to give Stephen Miller exactly what he deserves. That night, Margaret and Michael worked late preparing a counter-presentation. They gathered all the evidence of Stephen's misconduct, documented the ethical violations, and compiled testimonies from employees. But Margaret had a more elaborate plan than just firing Stephen. "Michael, do you trust me?" "Of course, Mom." "Then I need you to do exactly what I ask, in the order I ask, no matter how strange it seems." On Friday morning, Margaret arrived at work as usual. She put on her janitor's uniform, wore the wig, and grabbed the cleaning cart. But this time, she had a plan. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Margaret positioned herself strategically in the hallway, cleaning the windows of the meeting room where she could hear and be seen. Stephen walked into the room as always confident, carrying his briefcase with the presentation that would change the company's direction. "Good morning, everyone," he greeted the board members. "I have a very important presentation today." Michael sat at the head of the table, more serious than usual. "You may begin, Stephen." Stephen opened his presentation on the projector. "As you know, our company has grown significantly in recent years, but growth also means the need for modernization." While Stephen spoke about resource optimization and necessary restructuring, Margaret kept cleaning outside, listening to every word. "That's why I've prepared a comprehensive cost-cutting plan that could save up to 40% of our operational budget." "How?" asked Thompson. "By outsourcing unnecessary services and streamlining our workforce." Stephen showed the list of employees marked for termination. 23 names, including people who had worked at the company for decades. "These employees represent high costs without proportional returns," Stephen explained. "We can replace them with younger, cheaper professionals." That's when Michael gave the signal. "Stephen, before we continue, I need to present some information that has come to my attention." Michael stood up and walked to the door. "Margaret, could you come in here, please?" The board members were surprised to see the janitor enter the meeting room. "What is this, Michael?" Stephen asked, visibly irritated. "It means we have important matters to discuss," Michael replied. "Margaret, could you tell them what you told me yesterday?" Margaret removed her glasses and looked straight at Stephen. "With pleasure, Mr. Michael." And then, in a firm and clear voice, Margaret began to speak about everything she had uncovered. The diverted contracts, the shell company, the backdoor deals. Stephen paled as he heard the accusations. "This is absurd," he protested. "You're going to believe a janitor." "We'll believe the evidence." Michael placed the printed documents on the table. As the board members examined the proof, Stephen tried to defend himself. "She must have stolen this information. How would a mere janitor have access to confidential data?" Margaret smiled. "You're right, Mr. Miller. Or a mere janitor wouldn't have access to this information." She removed the wig, letting her natural hair show. "But the company's founder and majority shareholder would." The room fell completely silent. Stephen looked at Margaret as if seeing a ghost. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," Margaret addressed the board. "My name is Margaret Wilson, founder of Williams & Associates and Michael's mother." The board members were stunned. Thompson dropped his pen. Jennifer's eyes widened. "For the past 3 months, I've worked undercover as a janitor to observe firsthand how my company was being run," Margaret continued. "And what I discovered has left me deeply disappointed." Stephen tried to stand up, but Michael gestured for him to remain seated. "Not only did I discover that one of our managers is diverting contracts and planning mass layoffs," Margaret said, looking directly at Stephen, "but I also witnessed systematic humiliation against loyal and dedicated employees." "Margaret, Mrs. Wilson." Stephen tried to speak, but his voice came out shaky. "Mr. Miller, over these 3 months, you've thrown water on me, publicly humiliated me, questioned my competence, and even made up infractions to justify a future dismissal." Margaret stepped closer to the meeting table. "Did you know I built this company from the ground up? That I started with a 200-square-foot office in Soho and turned it into the company it is today?" Stephen couldn't respond. "Did you know every employee you marked for layoff helped build this company?" that old Bill has worked here since day one, that Deborah helped draft our first contracts. I didn't... You didn't know because you never bothered to learn about the people you work with, Margaret said, sitting in the empty chair. To you, employees are just numbers on a spreadsheet. Michael took control of the meeting. Given the evidence presented and the severity of the ethical violations, Mr. Miller's termination is inevitable. Wait, Margaret raised her hand. I'm not finished yet. Everyone turned to her. Mr. Miller, you will be fired, yes, but not today. Stephen looked confused. What do you mean? You'll work as a janitor for 1 month, Margaret declared. You'll learn the value of the work you so despised. You'll understand what it's like to be humiliated, questioned, disrespected. This is ridiculous. I won't accept this. You have 2 choices, Michael interjected. Accept my mother's conditions or be fired for cause, with all the legal implications of the misconduct we've uncovered. Stephen realized he had no choice. And after the month? After the month, we'll evaluate whether you've learned anything, Margaret replied. If you show genuine change, you can stay with the company in a position suited to your new level of humility. And if I don't, then you'll be fired. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The following days were surreal for Stephen Miller. Overnight, he found himself wearing a janitor's uniform, pushing a cart down the hallways he once walked in a suit and tie. On the first day, he tried to cling to his arrogance. This is temporary, he muttered to himself. Just 1 month. But Margaret had carefully instructed the cleaning supervisors on how to treat Stephen. He was to follow every rule, stick to schedules, and perform tasks exactly like any other employee. And it was Margaret who became his direct supervisor. Mr. Miller, she said on the first day, you'll start by cleaning the first floor restrooms. I want them spotless by 10 a.m. Stephen grabbed the cleaning supplies with a sour expression and got to work. He had never cleaned a bathroom in his life. He didn't even know where to begin. Excuse me, a woman's voice called out. It was Deborah. What? Stephen snapped. I was watching you clean. Can I give you a tip? Stephen looked at her with disdain, but realized he had no choice. Go ahead. You're using too much product. It'll leave streaks, and the cloth is too wet. Deborah demonstrated the right technique. Stephen watched, irritated at having to learn from someone he once considered beneath him. Thanks, he muttered. No problem. We help each other around here. During the first week, Stephen made every possible mistake. He broke 2 dishes, flooded a bathroom, mixed chemicals the wrong way, and created toxic fumes that evacuated half the floor. Margaret watched everything from a distance, occasionally stepping in with clear, patient instructions. Mr. Williams, you're in too much of a hurry, she'd say. Cleaning requires attention, care. It's not a job for someone who wants to rush out. I know how to clean, Stephen would reply defensively. I know you do. You just need to learn how to do it right. By the end of the first week, Stephen was exhausted. His hands were rough from the chemicals, his back ached from bending over so much, and his feet swelled from standing all day. He sat in the janitor's closet and for the first time in years questioned his own behavior. How had he been so cruel to people who did this hard work every day? In the second week, something began to change. Stephen stopped complaining so much and started paying attention to instructions. Old Bill approached him during break. How you holding up, kid? Tired, Stephen answered honestly. Yeah, cleaning's tough work. But it's got its rewards. What rewards? The satisfaction of leaving everything clean, organized, knowing your work makes a difference. Stephen had never thought of it that way. Old Bill, can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you never report me? All the times I disrespected you, talked down about your work. Old Bill smiled. Because I believed you'd learn one day. Learn what? That every job has dignity, that every person deserves respect. By the third week, Stephen started talking to other cleaning staff. He discovered life stories he'd never bothered to learn before. Mrs. Thompson, 60 years old, supported 5 grandchildren on her cleaning wages. Frank, 45, had lost his office job and had to take the cleaning position to avoid unemployment. "You do what you gotta do to support your family," Frank explained. "There's no work more honest than honest work." Stephen began to understand what these people faced every day. Financial struggles, lack of recognition, prejudice, and he started remembering his own past. He hadn't been born rich. His parents were small-town merchants in Ohio. Stephen had studied on a scholarship, worked to pay for college, fought for his first job. When had he forgotten that? When had he become so arrogant? By the fourth and final week, Margaret noticed a real change in Stephen. He arrived early, took pride in his work, helped his co-workers, and most importantly, he stopped belittling others. On the last day of the month, Margaret called him in for a talk. "Mr. Williams, how was this experience?" Stephen thought carefully before answering. "It was eye-opening." "In what way?" "I'd forgotten who I was, where I came from. I forgot that dignity doesn't come from your job title, but from your character." Margaret nodded. "And what do you plan to do with this lesson?" "I want to apologize to every employee I disrespected. I want to fix the mistakes I made. The contract violations, the shell company." "I dissolved the company and returned all the money," Stephen said, pulling a folder from the cabinet. "Here's all the proof." Margaret examined the documents. Everything was in order. "And what about your role at the company?" "If you'll give me a second chance, I'd like to stay, but in a position where I can actually help, not hurt anyone." Margaret was silent for a few minutes. "Mr. Williams, I'll make you an offer. I'm listening. You can return to the sales department, but not as a manager, as a senior sales rep. And you'll have to earn everyone's trust back." "I accept. There's one condition." "What is it?" "Once a week, you'll work a half day with the cleaning crew, so you never forget what you've learned." Stephen smiled. It was the first time Margaret had seen him smile genuinely. "I accept that too." 6 months later, Williams and Associates had completely transformed. Margaret officially returned to management, working side by side with Michael. They created a human development program that became a benchmark in the industry. Stephen kept his word. He personally apologized to every employee he had humiliated. He became an efficient but respectful salesman and never disrespected a colleague again. On Fridays, he wore the cleaning uniform and worked with the team, not out of obligation but by choice. Because he had learned that every experience teaches something valuable. The company thrived like never before. Employees felt valued, clients noticed the positive environment, and financial results were the best in the company's history. Margaret formed an advisory board where representatives from every department, including cleaning and maintenance, had a voice in major decisions. "A company is like an orchestra," she explained in speeches to other business leaders. "Every instrument matters. If the violinist looks down on the triangle, the music falls out of tune." During one of these talks, someone in the audience asked, "Mrs. Wilson, wasn't it risky to expose yourself like that? What if Stephen had discovered your identity?" Margaret smiled. "The bigger risk would have been leaving my company in the hands of someone who didn't respect their employees. I'd rather risk being found out than risk losing the soul of the business I built." "And how do you assess Mr. Miller's change?" "Stephen wasn't a bad person. He was lost. Sometimes people just need a chance to reconnect with who they really are." After the talk, Stephen approached her. "Mrs. Wilson, may I speak with you?" "Of course, Stephen. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For believing I could change." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stephen, everyone deserves a second chance. What matters is knowing how to make the most of it. I have, and not just at work. I've become a better father, husband, and person. I'm glad to hear that. Mrs. Wilson, can I ask you a personal question?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you fire me on the first day? It would have been much easier." Margaret considered her answer. "Because firing you would have been punishment, and punishment teaches nothing. I wanted you to learn, and the only way to learn is by living it." "Did you always know I'd change?" "I didn't, but I had hope, and sometimes hope is all we need to give someone a chance." That evening, Margaret was at home when Michael returned from work. "Mom, how did you know the plan would work?" "I didn't, son, but I knew it was worth trying. And if it hadn't worked, then we'd have learned a different lesson." Michael sat beside his mother. "Mom, thank you for coming back. The company needed you. The company needed both of us, Michael. You to lead the future, me to preserve its values. And now you're ready to take full charge. I'll retire for real this time, but you'll still give your opinions, right?" Margaret laughed. "Of course I will. Mothers always have opinions." 2 years later, Williams & Associates won the award for the best company to work for in the state of New York. During the ceremony, Michael made sure to call Margaret to the stage. "This award isn't mine," he said into the microphone. "It belongs to every employee in our company, but especially to the woman who taught me that leadership isn't about power, it's about service." Margaret stepped onto the stage, moved. "I want to share this award with someone who represents the potential for change in all of us." She called Stephen to the stage. Stephen climbed up, visibly emotional. "This man humiliated me, disrespected me, threw water in my face," Margaret told the audience. "But he also taught me that everyone can change, that no one is lost forever." She turned to Stephen. "Thank you for letting me see the person you truly are." Stephen couldn't hold back his tears. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, for believing in me when even I didn't believe in myself." The audience rose in applause. In the car on the way home, Michael asked, "Mum, what was the hardest part of all this?" "What do you mean, son?" "Working undercover, enduring the humiliation." Margaret thought about the question. "The hardest part wasn't enduring the humiliation, Michael. It was realizing I had built a company where such humiliation was possible." "How so?" "I created a structure where someone like Stephen could thrive, where employees were afraid to report abuse. That made me rethink everything." "And what was the easiest part?" "Remembering that behind every job title there's a person, with dreams, fears, stories. When you see people that way, everything becomes easier." Michael drove in silence for a few minutes. "Mom, can I confess something?" "Of course." "At first, when I found out you were working as a janitor, I was angry." "Why?" "Because I thought you didn't trust me." "And now?" "Now I understand you were protecting me and protecting the company." "I was protecting what I love most in the world, son. You and the legacy we built together." 5 years passed. Williams & Associates became one of the most admired companies in the country. Their human-centered management model was copied by hundreds of other businesses. Margaret had truly retired but still visited the company regularly. She always spoke with employees at every level, always kept an ear open for potential problems. During one of these visits, she found a new employee crying in the bathroom. "What happened, dear?" "Oh, Mrs. Wilson, it's just my supervisor treated me badly in front of everyone." "Which supervisor?" "Mr. Sullivan." Margaret knew Sullivan. He was a recently hired manager. "What did he do?" "He called me incompetent because I didn't understand a report." Margaret felt a familiar pang. It was as if history was repeating itself. "What's your name?" "Rachel." "Rachel, can you do me a favor?" "Of course, Mrs. Wilson." "Can you write down exactly what happened? Date, time, who was present?" "I can, but why?" Margaret smiled. "Because every company needs guardians, and guardians never sleep." The next day, Margaret was in Michael's office. "Son, we need to talk about Sullivan." Michael sighed. "What did he do now?" "You already suspected something?" "There have been a few informal complaints, but nothing official." "Michael, I think it's time for another investigation." "Mum, you're not thinking of—" "I am," Margaret said with a mischievous smile. "Do you know a good cleaning company?" Michael laughed. "Mum, you're 70. So, experience is experience. You promised you'd retired." "I retired from management. I didn't retire from caring for people." Michael shook his head but was smiling. "Fine, but this time I'm coming with you." "What do you mean?" "If you're going undercover, so am I. As a cleaning assistant." Margaret burst out laughing. "Michael, are you sure?" "I am. Someone has to look after you." "And who'll look after the company?" Stephen. He's ready to take over as general manager. Margaret looked at her son with pride. You know what, Michael? What? I think I've finally learned how to retire. How so? Because now I know you've learned to care for people the way I did. And that's all a mother could want. Michael hugged Margaret. Mom, thank you for everything. You're welcome, son. Now let's go buy those cleaning uniforms. We have work to do. Outside the office, Deborah was organizing Michael's schedule when she heard the laughter coming from the meeting room. She smiled. She had known the Wilsons long enough to realize they were planning something. And she could hardly wait to see what would happen, because at Williams & Associates, every day was a chance to learn that people are always more important than the titles they hold, and that a mother never stops protecting what she loves. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story of overcoming and transformation. Do you believe Stephen truly changed, or do you think it was just self-interest? And what do you think about Margaret's bold strategy? Share your honest opinion in the comments, and if the story moved you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.